thing, or is this a spiritual thing? If it is a medical thing, can we get some assistance from, say, a primary care physician, and in conjunction with counseling? So consider that to be very, very important.
Good point. There's spiritual and there's medical. And how do we differentiate between the two is key too.
Self-education, I don't know who mentioned it, but self-education is a big, big deal.
Right. Do you want to add anything? Yeah, sure. So we're talking about, we kind of went the gamut there. We're basically talking about how mental illness is approached by, first, the church member. Where do they find the help that they need? And how do they know between medical and spiritual, which avenue to take? Do they go to their pastor or their doctor?
Well, one of the things about addressing it from the perspective of being a church member, a Christian, often people will think, well, there must be something wrong with me spiritually, or I wouldn't be having these kind of problems. It's one thing to have a backache, but if you have an emotional kind of problem, it must be maybe a sin or something like that, and not necessarily true. Most of us have some sort of emotional struggle. Others have, these kinds of problems can become worse. And sometimes we're not even necessarily aware of it, to the point where our whole lifestyle is affected, our relationships with folks at church and at work and everything. And they may be aware of it, and we may not be. And so people begin to avoid us, or say things that we consider strange. Why do they say that? And yet they don't know how to tell us. Maybe consider some sort of professional help, like a counselor. So we need to be forthcoming with folks if we can, when we can, and try not to offend, but also knowing that if they get competent professional help, they're going to do better in every way, really. And especially if you have access to a Christian therapist, that would be great, because you can get a totally well-rounded approach to it, not only psychologically but also from the perspective of being a Christian.
Thank you.
Katie, I'd like
Yeah.
to just add to the end of that when a pastor is referring, it's not handing off and washing your hands of it. I know a lot of people, they have this idea like, wow, I don't want to have to deal with this. I'd like to be the ostrich and stick my head in the sand and hope it goes away. But a good pastor is not going to do that. He's going to realize that, and even though we're all Christians, of course not all Christians believe in a trichotomy, some believe in a dichotomy, that a man is only a mind and a body, and the mind includes the spirit. I'm the trichotomy. I believe in the spirit, the mind, and the body. And in order for somebody to be whole, all of that needs to be healthy. And so it's not handing off and washing your hands of it. It's bringing in some professional help that can come along beside you and be your partner in helping this person live a good life.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a team. It's a team, right? So support team. Good. So we covered that page, panelists. I think we did that thoroughly. We're going to go on the next page here. Understanding the causes medical, not spiritual. And this is where Pastor Brad was. Oh, you have a question? Okay.
It's not even a question. So you, Pastor Brad, I'm just thinking, you had mentioned it's mind and brain, or mind and brain.
Pardon?
If I'm not mistaken, you said mind and brain.
I was just talking about the mind and brain
And I
connection.
agree with your analogy, but I also think within myself it's my heart and my soul.
Sure. I mean, there's more to us than just the brain and your mind. I was just talking about what we call the mind is a result of the function of the brain. And the mind then, and the soul, and the spirit, and your heart. In fact, there's research by some neuroscientists that say there is a piece of the brain that comes in from the heart that has our conscience in it, and things like that. We're very complex. Yeah. No,
That's a
I
good
didn't
question.
mean that there was only brain and,
No,
yeah.
I was just
I
adding.
hardly have a brain tonight,
I've heard-
but,
I've heard people say that he is heartless.
Just so y'all know, though, also, we will have a Q&A session afterwards. So as soon as we get through the panel discussion, the floor is open. Okay, so mental illness is just that, an illness. Pastor Brad Hapes, in his book Fresh Hope, which is available for sale back there, describes its origins as, quote, a biological condition involving brain chemistry and genetics. And mental illness does not arise from character flaws, lack of faith, or poor choices, or spiritual activity, I might add. Mood disorders are a medical condition. There's no more shame here than if we had diabetes, arthritis, or any other medical ailment. It is logical, reasonable, and sensible to treat medical disorders. This includes mental disorders. The sooner you overcome your inner stigma about mental illness, the faster and healthier to your recovery you will be. The longer you hold off, the sicker you'll become. So, we're kind of going around on the same note as we were just talking about, but I wanted to ask the pastors why they think the church tends to over-spiritualize the emotional mood disorders, and why they think churches want to address it under spiritual life rather than medical.
there's not a theological dynamic to that. The most medical people will tell you that the last great frontier is the brain. And so, years ago, the church was against this or against that, and then science and medical things came along. And I think churches will and are going to be forced, more and more denominations, to have a theology regarding the brain.
So where does that theology come from where it sneaks in and says, oh, well, it might be some kind of satanic, demonic, something, et cetera, et cetera? Because I've heard that, I believe that myself,
Mm-hmm.
you know?
Where does the theology come? I think the pastor's getting educated and learning. And then, because for instance, if people say none of it's demonic, my psychiatrist would tell you everything in this world is broken, and that comes from the enemy. Illness itself is demonic, but that doesn't make it be that somebody's possessed or somebody's this or somebody's that. Now, if you're Pentecostal, you may believe that someone can have those things, and I would say the enemy can mimic anything. And but if it's medical, medicine will help. And if it's spiritual, medicine won't help. And I talked to some psychiatrists that actually believe that mental illness, or what looks to be mental illness, sometimes is a form of some spiritual stuff going on. And they had very clear ways that they weeded that out. But they said it's something like 90-something% of what they had discovered was always, it was mental illness,
I would like to insert my experience personally. At 16, when I first had the onset of the depression and the mania, I went into psychosis after switching meds cold turkey and had an experience of hearing voices that were demonic in nature. So, was I possessed, or was I a Christian saved by the grace of God, hearing things in the spiritual realm that drug had opened up the door to? Right? So,
Right.
I'm on my medicine, never heard anything since. Clearly,
That's a pretty good clue.
I think
It was chemical.
it was chemical.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's definitely possible that, it's not, just because Christ has defeated the strong man, he's bound him, and he doesn't have rain on the earth today like he did in the past, doesn't mean that he's still not loose. So for somebody to say that demonic activity isn't real, well, then angelic activity isn't. However, in your case, for instance, I think it's pretty clear that honestly, you probably weren't listening into demonic voices that were being heard all of a sudden because your chemical levels were off. It was probably just your own mind playing tricks on you. Now, of course, I can't definitively say that, but more than likely, that probably was the case. And the fact that you got good medication and those voices stopped being heard is probably, a good indication that that's so. I would like to say that I think it's impossible to answer your question definitively about why is it that so many pastors want to apply simply a spiritual answer to every mental illness situation, because I think there are so many answers to that. I think that some pastors are probably afraid that they can't deal with this, and so they want to diminish it so that they don't look unqualified or maybe less than. And then, of course, on the other hand, maybe they've seen, because this is still new medicine, this is still new science. I mean, it's not, fixing the brain's the hardest thing in the world to do. It's not like fixing your arm. And so they probably have seen people that have been medicated improperly and seen terrible results from that, sometimes even to the point, let's face it, suicide and things like that. And then so they want to shy away from that as much as possible. And so some pastors might say, don't have anything to do with that. I knew Johnny, and Johnny had this experience.
It's a delicate balance, bargain with medicine.
So I don't think there's a definitive answer. I think there are
Brad
many
and then
answers.
Steve.
Just a very simple way of that I help pastors understand the physicality of emotions and things. For instance, if you've ever known someone that has a brain tumor, they will start to not make sense. And we had a friend that listening to him was funny, because whatever he was saying, he meant to say the opposite of what he was saying. And he went through a phase. We all understood. It was because he had a brain tumor. It was affecting his functioning. If somebody has Tourette's, we get that. If somebody has a learning disability, we get that. This is no different. This is just no different. And so it becomes, we don't judge them morally. We don't look at it as being a spiritual flaw that they got sick or whatever. Now, you can decide to participate with your illness. You can decide a whole bunch of stuff, which is a whole other thing. But
Okay, thank you. And Steve, and then Steve.
Okay.
Oh, and
In love and with respect, I say ignorance. Ignorance. That there are some bodies of faith that operate from the mindset that because I've got this, I've got it all, I don't need outside intervention. And I feel sorry for them, because I don't believe it works that way. I just don't believe it works that way. And I'll pass it on.
Just to respond to the scientific methods to show or prove that mental disorders are real. Certain mental disorders, say, for example, bipolar disorder, you may have heard of that one, has a great deal to do with body chemistry, and so, and when people seek treatment for that particular kind of illness, or others, of course, such as depression, anxiety, very often brain chemistry is out of balance, and testing can show whether or not that's true. Behavior is also usually an issue, and sometimes people get that confused and say, oh, there must be something wrong with my behavior, but sometimes brain chemicals can mislead us and we don't even realize that's happening. Certain disorders, this is very prominent, and so balancing the brain chemicals through medication and so on can really help a person come back to a normal way of living pretty quickly.
That's great, that's great. Go ahead, Dr. Smith.
Thank you. I think one of the challenges, especially of the first question, is we tend to over spiritualize our emotional mood. Churches tend to do this. Is one of the challenges is we tend to connect our spirituality to how we feel, rather than who Christ has made us. Does that make sense? So in the first chapter of Ephesians, as a matter of fact, before we get to the oughts, what we ought to do, Paul outlines to the saints in Ephesus who they are. And none of that has to do with their own work. It is solely done by the work of God in Christ. Okay? So when we talk about mental illnesses and everything else like that, it has nothing to do with your spirituality. Your spirituality has everything to do with your identity, your spiritual identity. Even if the brain is not functioning properly, that doesn't change one's position. And we should not base our spirituality on how we feel, but on who Christ has said we are in Him. Secondly, science is applied objective data. So science is a discipline. It's objective data. So if mood disorders are real, we should be able to observe them, right? And we do. We can observe them. We observe them by way of MRIs and fMRIs, and there's certain types of surveys and tests, like the MMPI, for example, we could look at to see various psychotic disorders because it's consistent within the test itself. So, yes, science does show that brain chemistry is out of balance, and it's observable data. We can see it and observe it.
We were joking because you're throwing around a lot of acronyms.
Oh.
What was it?
Well, if I would have said it, then it
It would have taken.
Yeah, it's do or die. Catch 22.
We trust you. Good, thank you for that information. That's so key, because that's what I was kind of getting to in the question. Where is it in science? And we answered that. Thank you. Thank you all for your answers. Very insightful. Okay,